The sun will rise, the moon will set.
What we're looking at is not just FASD or ADHD, we're actually looking at a general problem in North America. A problem in, I think it's too warm a little bit out here. A problem in parenting, in child rearing, in education very much, and certainly a problem in medical practice. Because what we're seeing these days, we have a lot of kids who are being diagnosed left, right, and center with all kinds of disorders. And a lot of parents are getting more and more perturbed about how to handle their children's behaviors. The North American response is one of two possible, not only possible, but one of two main approaches. The first is behavioral. In the behavioral approach, we take the behavior and we don't like it, so we try to change it. How do you change the behavior? Well, how do you punish the kid for it? And then the idea is if you punish them enough, they won't behave that way anymore. Or we reward them for the good behavior. The idea being, if you reward them for the good behavior, then they're more likely to engage in that. Now, notice that in neither of these cases are we concerned with what's causing the behavior. We're just looking at the behavior. We like it or we don't like it. So we say, more of this, less of that. Here's the punishment. Here's the reward. That's the behavioral approach. Which gets us to Toronto in June of last year, where a 9-year-old kid was handcuffed in school. And what happened was that this kid had Asperger's, and he had, as a part of Asperger's, as the part of all of these childhood problems, is poor impulse control and lack of ability to read social cues. So this kid, with his inability to read, hi there. I didn't mean to exclude you. So this kid, because he's different, he's got Asperger's, he's bullied. That's what happens to these kids. They get bullied. ADHD kids get bullied more often. Asperger's kids get bullied more often. Bullying is a whole other subject. So he got really upset in the classroom, and he started yelling or screaming or something. The teachers thought that the best way to deal with this would be to lock him in a room by himself, which they did, at which point he totally lost it, proceeded to break up the furniture, at which point they called the cops. And the kid ends up in handcuffs, a 9-year-old, in a school, in this country. The debate afterwards was, did the police do the right thing in handcuffing a child? Which is, of course, a completely pointless debate and the wrong question. The right question is, because once you call the police, they're going to do what the police do, which is to restrain people. That's what they learn how to do. The right question is, why was the school so devoid of understanding of what this child behavior was all about that could only respond by trying to suppress the behavior? In other words, the school wasn't asking themselves. They had no understanding of what actually is going on in the brain of this child, poor impulse control, or what's upsetting him, and how to deal with an upset child. It's all about behavior control. So that's one approach. So, and it shows up very early in the parenting literature. If a 2-year-old doesn't behave, or a 3-year-old, what do? You banish him, time out. It's a pure behavior thing. You don't care what the kid is experiencing, feeling. You just want to control the behavior. I'll come back to timeouts later on. But the essence of it is separation. And we do that a lot with kids. Separation as a way of controlling behavior. Now the other approach, when the behavioral techniques fail, is to medicalize childhood conditions. So we have this whole panoply of childhood diagnoses. Of course, FASD, ADHD, Asperger's, Tourette's, conduct disorders, oppositional defiant disorder, pervasive developmental disorder, and so on. And being that we see them as medical problems, we also have a medical response to them, which is to medicate kids. So, thank you. So right now, in North America, we have a situation where there are 3 million of kids receiving stimulant medications in the United States, tens of thousands in Canada. As I mentioned last night, the number of prescriptions for stimulant medications has gone up 43% in this country in the last 5 years, 5 times in the previous 15 years. 1 in 10 of American children is now said to meet the diagnostic criteria for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And we have 500,000 kids in the United States, many tens of thousands of Canada, including hundreds or thousands perhaps in this province, who are receiving heavy-duty antipsychotic medications, such as we give to adult schizophrenics. And these kids are not getting it because they're psychotic, they're getting it as means of behavior control. The side effects can be horrendous: weight gain, risk of diabetes, heart disease, acne, all kinds of stuff, personality changes, to the point where BC Children's Hospital has had to establish a clinic to deal with the side effects of these medications. Now the reality is that these antipsychotics have never been studied in children. We haven't got a clue what the long-term consequences will be on their brain development if they're given antipsychotics. I'm not talking about the stimulants for ADHD, I'm talking about the antipsychotics for behavior control. We don't have a clue what the long-term consequences will be. What we do know about the ADHD medications is that they don't seem to have negative consequences in the long term, but they also don't do any good in the long term. They help in short term in behavior control and in focus, suppressing hyperactivity, but they do nothing for the child in the long term. But if it's a medical problem, we deal with it by means of a medical solution. The assumption, of course, is that we don't know what causes these behaviors, or if it's a medical problem, it's probably genetic. And most clinicians that deal with ADHD are still assuming that it's a genetic condition that you inherit. So for example, I've been diagnosed with ADHD, which I have, as have a couple of my kids. There's the proof it's got to be genetic, passed it on genetically. Now, of course, both of these approaches look only at surface manifestations. The behaviors are not diseases, they're manifestations of an underlying problem. When you diagnose a kid with ADHD or Asperger's or Tourette's, you haven't explained anything. You've described something. You've described a set of behaviors or personality patterns that you can fit into a category. But it's not an explanation. You haven't said a thing as to why the kid's got the condition. You just described it. Now that may be helpful, so that you have a general approach to the child. You know, you can describe the child and understand the pattern of his behaviors as, you know, belonging together into a spectrum or into some kind of a syndrome, but you have not explained it. And therefore, to try and change behaviors or to simply hand out medications is to fiddle with effects, but not to in any way have an impact on causes. So my intention here is to give you a perspective that encourages us and even allows us to deal with causes, not just the original cause of the child's condition, but the causes right now in his or her present situation. And as those of you that heard me speak this morning or last night, that perspective is called the biopsychosocial perspective, which says that the biology of the child's brain and body is reflective of and is shaped by the emotional and psychological environment. So I'm not saying that there isn't a biological problem here. Sure there is. If you do a study, for example, in Alberta, they looked at electroencephalograms, EEGs, which is a printout of the electrical activity of the child's brain, of adolescent males with ADHD. And they found that at rest, in a normal state, you compare the EEGs to kids without ADHD, there's no difference. But then when you give these kids a math problem, in the non-ADHD group, the frontal lobe of the brain, the front part here, shows increased fast wave activity. In other words, the brain is starting to do more work to solve the math problem. in the brain of the ADHD child, you have diminished activity. So instead of speeding up, the brain actually slows down. That's a biological effect. But the question is, what's causing it? Just because it's biological doesn't make it genetic. So it's not an issue, is it biological or not? The issue is what creates and influences the biology. And what I'm saying to you is that what creates and influences the biology is actually the environment. Now, let me go back to my own personal history a bit. So I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was 52 years old, and I was the medical coordinator of the palliative care unit at Vancouver Hospital. And I was a busy and accomplished family physician, and I was writing a weekly medical column for the Globe and Mail. And the social worker on the unit, Betsy Jo Spicer, said, "I want to have coffee with you." I said, "Okay, it's coffee." So we had coffee, and 3 minutes of the conversation, I got why it was with me that she wanted to have coffee. It was because she recognized me as part of her tribe. In other words, everything she said about herself, I recognized in myself. So I'll read you something about that from my book on ADHD, Scattered Minds. To dip my toe in was to know that unawares I had been immersed in it all my life, up to my neck. This realization may be called the stage of ADD epiphany, the Annunciation, characterized by insight, elation, enthusiasm, and hope. It seemed to me that I had found the passage to those dark recesses of my mind from which chaos issues without warning, hurling thoughts, plans, emotions, and intentions in all directions. I felt I had discovered what it was that had always kept me from attaining psychological integrity, wholeness, the reconciliation and joining together of the disharmonious fragments of my mind. ADD seemed to explain many of my behavior patterns, thought processes, childish emotional reactions, my workaholism and other addictive tendencies, the sudden eruptions of bad temper and complete irrationality. You're wondering, who, you? No. The conflicts in my marriage and my Jekyll and Hyde ways of relating to my children. So, what I'm going to tell you here is about this impulse control. Now, one of the traits, ADHD's got 3 major traits, by the way, which are also salient traits of FASD, as you'll notice. For impulse control being one of them. And impulse control means just what it sounds like. Impulses are not thoughts that we consciously necessarily even aware of, or at least sometimes not till too late. Impulses are urges to behave, to do something, that arise from the lower brain centers. So the example I might give is, let's say, you're sitting there, Martin, with 3 really good-looking cookies. And I might have the impulse to grab one of them and shove them in my mouth. That's fine, nothing wrong with that impulse. But something up here in the gray matter of my brain, the cortex, is meant to say, not yours, his. You're a lecturer right now. You're supposed to be speaking, not eating cookies. And if you do that, you might never get invited back to Smithers. Okay? That's basically impulse regulation. Now, those are not conscious thoughts. There's just a circuit with all that information that says, Now, in kids with ADHD, FASD, Tourette's, Asperger's, autism, conduct disorders, etc., there's poor impulse control. And, by the way, in what adults do you also have poor impulse control? Saliently. I mean, in many adults you do. But what adults specifically? Well, addicts, of course. So that they'll do the thing that they know is not good for them because there's no impulse regulation. If you do brain scans on drug addicts, the commonest finding is that the part of the brain that's meant to regulate impulses just doesn't function. Which is why these childhood conditions of poor self-regulation and impulse control are such risk factors for addiction later on. ADHD is a significant risk factor for addiction in an adult. For that reason and for other reasons as well. So is FASD, of course. Now, poor impulse control, that's one of the traits of ADHD. So let me tell you what I did. And I have to preface this by telling you that as a physician, I was never one to be too quick with the prescription tag. I was always much more interested in, thinking or talking a problem through and dealing with it rather than quickly reaching for the pharmacological response. Except when it came to myself. With an impatience and lack of judgment characteristic of ADD, I had already begun to self-medicate even before the formal diagnosis. A sense of urgency typifies attention deficit disorder, a desperation to have immediately whatever it is that one may desire at the moment, be it an object, an activity, or a relationship. And there was something else here too, well expressed by a woman who some months later came for help. It would be nice to get a break from myself, at least for a little while, she said, a sentiment I fully understood. One longs to escape the fatiguing, ever-spinning, ever-churning mind. I took Ritalin in a higher than recommended initial dose on the very day I first heard about attention deficit disorder. As a doctor, you can do this. I went to my friend Bev, with palliative care. Bev, I think I got ADD, can you give me some Ritalin? Oh sure, how much do you want? Professional secret. Within minutes I felt euphoric and present, experienced myself as full of insight and love. My wife thought I was acting weird. You look stoned, was her immediate comment. Now within a few days, so what I'm demonstrating here is the lack of impulse control. Within a few days, I was very focused. I became very depressed on the Ritalin. That's one of the side effects. Not for everybody, but for me, that's one of the side effects. So I got off that, went to see a psychiatrist, was diagnosed. And I was given another stimulant, which helped me. In some ways, and in other ways it created some problems. Now, the other two traits of ADD are, besides poor impulse control, are hyperactivity. So that's when you got the H in there, hyperactivity. So that, that's why I like to have a lapel mic and walk around rather than in front of a stationary mic. And so doodling and fidgeting and restlessness, difficulty sitting still, that's all a trait of ADHD. And then the third characteristic is poor attention skills, difficulty focusing, staying on task when you're not interested in something. So a kid with ADHD can sit there for a whole 5 hours or 8 hours in front of a video game. Doesn't mean they got no ADHD, it just means that they're tuned up with the TV set. So if you're not interested, you can't pay attention. So you're absent-minded, you're talking to somebody and you notice that they're just somewhere else. In a lecture, you might wander a lot. Listen to a piece of music, you might not be able to stay on the music. You start to do something, your attention wanders, you don't complete the first activity and you go on to the next. And this is what these kids are like. So you just start doing homework and 3 minutes later, their attention is somewhere else. So these are the traits. But the question is, and I'm already seeing the nods of self-recognition in the room. Now the question is, what is this all about? Well, what I didn't buy into right from the beginning, even though I didn't really know the answer as to what this is all about, one thing I didn't buy into right from the beginning is that this is some kind of a genetic disorder. And the reason I didn't buy into the genetic disorder hypothesis, despite the fact that I had it, and I soon recognized that 2 of my kids did, is something that was just written up, if I can find it. In fact, here it is. In this month's edition of Pediatrics, which is the official journal of the American Pediatrics Academy. And it's called an integrated scientific framework for child survival in early childhood development. Everything I've been saying for the last 12 years is in this article. Not that I've made it all up, I'm just saying that I've been saying these things because that's how I see it. But the research has been there, but now it's not even controversial anymore. Not controversial, but that doesn't mean that most doctors know about it. They don't. The perspective I'm giving you now is completely foreign to the medical profession. Most of them. So if you ever go to Children's Hospital in Vancouver, you'll never hear this stuff. And that's a whole other question as to why not. But here's what the article says. Growing scientific evidence demonstrates that the social and physical environments that threaten human development can lead to, just listen to this, can lead to short-term physiologic and psychological adjustments that are necessary for immediate survival and adaptation, but which may come at a significant cost to long-term outcomes in learning, behavior, health, and longevity. They're saying that temporary adaptive survival techniques or survival modalities that help the child navigate difficulties at a certain point, if they become embedded in the child, ingrained in the child, they lead to difficulties later. That's what tuning out is. Now, let me give you an example. See, tuning out is nothing genetic, it's not a genetic disease, it's just a survival thing. Let's say that you were sitting here with a bad bellyache and all kinds of anxiety about your mortgage. Okay? Those are two stressful things. But let's say you got a text message saying that somebody you love and care about is in the emergency ward with severe injury. What would happen to your concern about mortgage or your bellyache? You totally tune them out in order to adapt to the needs of the situation. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's a good thing in the short term. But what happens if you tune out in the long term? When you don't pay attention to what matters, and you get disconnected from your body. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? So the question is, how does a temporary state that serves a survival function becomes a long-term trait? Okay? So tuning out is actually just a self-defense under certain situations. The question is, why does it get programmed into the brain? Under what conditions? Now, again, I'm not saying this thing is not biological. Obviously, the kid is hyperactive and can't focus, or an adult for that matter, and they take a Ritalin tablet or a Dexedrine or Concerta or Adderall or whatever they take, and now they can focus and can calm down. That means that something biologically has happened in the brain. So we're talking about a biological effect. The real question is, what creates the biology? Again, the conventional explanation that is simply passed on genetically. But you see, that's a problem. It's an intellectual problem, because if it's genetic, if all these conditions are significantly genetic, then why are they increasing? Genes don't change in a population over 10 years, 15 years, 500 years, 1,000 years. So for something to be genetic, you need a much longer time for it to show up. When things are increasing to such a degree, we know we're not talking about heritable problems. We've got to be talking about something in the environment. So that alone should tell us. Now, what I truly didn't know, because nobody in medical school has talked about those things when I went to school 32 years ago or 35 years ago, and nobody talks about them now, is that the human brain develops actually an interaction with the environment. That's not controversial. That's just state-of-the-art brain science. The human brain actually develops an interaction with the environment. So which circuits develop and which do not has to do with the input from the environment. So for example, if you have a child with perfectly good eyes and good genes at birth, and you put him in a dark room for 5 years so he never sees light, he'll be blind thereafter for the rest of his life. Because for the development of the 30 or so circuits that make up the visual apparatus, you need the input of light waves. If there's no light there, even the few circuits that are present at birth will atrophy and die, and new ones will not develop, and that child is blind for the rest of his life. This is a critical period for the development of the visual circuits, which require the input of light. Now, it's not any different for the circuits of impulse regulation, emotional self-regulation. Emotional self-regulation simply means that it's like the thermostat in this room. If it's too cold, the heat will come on. If it's too warm, the air conditioner will come on to keep an even temperature. Because human beings can only function within a certain range of comfortable temperature. Or any creature can only can. Well, emotionally, it's the same thing. We can't function at the extremes of upset and rage or elation. When somebody is at those extremes, we call them bipolar. You can't function at those extremes of elation or depression. So there has to be some internal thermostat that brings us back to emotional balance. And that's the function of certain circuits in the brain. Now these kids lack it. So one of the other things that these kids lack, FASD kids, ADHD kids, all these other kids, they lack the capacity to regulate themselves emotionally. And a lot of us as adults do as well. Now, the regulation of the body so that we're not hyperactive, we can sit still, that's a developmental thing. It has to develop or it doesn't develop. The ability to pay attention. Infants have no capacity to focus. It has to develop. The infant's eyes are... So their capacity to focus is a developmental task, a developmental achievement. Now, as I said, just as the stimulation of light waves is required for the development of the visual circuits, in the same way, the stimulation from the environment is required for the development of all these other circuits that are impaired in all these conditions that we're talking about, from FASD to ADHD to everything else that I've mentioned. And that's because most of human brain development occurs after birth. So if you compare this to a horse can run on the first day of life. Human beings can't muster that much coordination, balance, visual acuity until a year and a half, 2 years. Well, that means that the horse, at the moment of birth, is 18 to 24 months ahead of us in terms of brain development. Now, why is that, by the way? Like, why are we so behind the horse? It has to do with evolutionary logic, because, of course, what gave impetus to the development of the brain was the use of the forepaws as hands and the digits as fingers. So as we start to do this and hold objects and use tools, our brain gets larger and larger to plan and control all that stuff. So our brains are getting larger in the front part of the head here. And at the same time, to make full use of our capacity to use the hand, we begin walking on two legs. Now to walk on two legs, the pelvis has to get narrower, because you can't walk on two legs with the pelvis of a horse. So we get a narrower pelvis, a larger head. What's the punchline? The punchline is, if you're given birth, is that you got to be born at 9 months, because if you waited till 11 months, you wouldn't be, because the head would be too big. Already at 9 months, the human head is the largest part of the body, and it's the one most likely to get stuck in the birth canal. It barely makes it out, If it was much larger, we wouldn't be born. So we have to be born prematurely. That means our brain development has to occur on the outside, where we no longer necessarily have the relative safety of the womb. Now I say relative safety because already what happens in utero to pregnant women has an impact on the developing child. So that stress on mothers during pregnancy will lead to behavioral problems in the child at age 3 or 4. That's been shown in recent studies. Women who were abused in pregnancy, in a British study, they had higher levels of the stress hormone cortisol in their placenta at birth, and their children were more likely to have ADHD at age 7 or 8. Now there was the stress on the pregnant woman already, and I could quote you lots of studies. There's a whole new science about this now, and societies and publications are dedicated to nothing but study the impact of pregnancy and stress on pregnancy on the developing child. And I'm talking about still in the relative safety of the uterus. Now what happens on the outside? What happens on the outside is that the brain is shaped by the interactions with the parent caregivers. And I read you a quote from Dr. Daniel Siegel, who's one of the leading researchers in this field, a psychiatrist at UCLA. And he says, For the infant and young child, attachment relationships are the major environmental factors that shape the development of the brain during its period of maximal growth. Attachment establishes an interpersonal relationship that helps the immature brain use the mature functions of the parent's brain to organize its own processes. So for the child to develop self-regulation, they have to connect with the parent who's also self-regulated. But what happens when the parent is depressed or stressed or alcoholic or otherwise not functioning in a self-regulated fashion? The child's brain doesn't get the input for self-regulation. Because the necessary condition for the development of these key brain circuits, just as for vision you need the presence of light waves, for these crucial circuits you need the presence of non-stressed, non-depressed, emotionally available, consistently available, attuned parenting caregivers. Non-stressed, non-depressed, emotionally available, consistently available, attuned parenting caregivers. Absent that, the child's brain circuits don't develop the way they should. At the University of Washington in Seattle, they've done EEGs, electroencephalograms, on the infants of mothers who had postpartum depression. Now, EEGs are the electrical printout of the activity of the brain, as I just told you. And they compared the EEGs of these 6-month-olds whose mothers were depressed with infants whose mothers were not depressed. And you know what? You could tell from the EEG of the child whose mother was depressed and who wasn't. In other words, the electrical activity of the child's brain reflected the moods of the parent. Now, I'll have to pause here for a moment and ask, are we blaming mothers? Well, we're not. Does any woman get depressed on purpose? Does any woman choose to be depressed to screw up her child? No. Depression is what happens to people under certain conditions. My wife had a postpartum depression with our daughter, who's now 23, and she's got ADHD. The postpartum depression in the mother is a major risk factor for ADHD in a child. If you do, if the mom is depressed in the child's first year of life, that child will have abnormal stress hormone levels in the 3rd year of life. In other words, the mother's depression in the first year affects the brain functioning much later on. Why did my wife have a postpartum depression? It's very simple. Because she was married to an ADHD workaholic physician with poor self-regulation. Very stressful. And no emotional support. I was too busy out there being an important doctor in the world to be present for my own family. So she gets depressed, and then our daughter doesn't get the right input that she needs. And now she's got ADHD. So I passed it on all right, but I didn't pass it on genetically. I passed it on because the conditions in our home were such that healthy development could not take place. And when we give Ritalin to kids or to adults, we're elevating the level of a chemical in the brain called dopamine. Dopamine is the essential chemical for incentive and motivation. When you don't have it, you have no motivation. You can measure the brain dopamine levels of infant monkeys, and they're normal. And then you separate them from their mothers, and within 4 or 5 days, their dopamine levels are diminished. So the presence of the mother is required to maintain the chemistry of the child's brain. Now, the mother, or the mothering figure, whether it's the grandfather or whoever's taking care of the child, can be absent in 2 ways. You can be absent physically, or you can be absent emotionally. And the psychologist, Alan Shore, calls that proximal separation. Proximal separation is when the parent is physically there, but emotionally absent. So I could give myself as an example of that. I was quite capable of reading my children a story and have my mind somewhere else at the same time. So I'd be reading the story, but if they asked me a question, I couldn't answer it because my mind wasn't on the story. Now, what do you suppose the child makes of that? How does the child interpret that? What's that?
You don't want to be there.
They don't want to be there. I'm not available to them. They're not worthwhile.
So
only way the child can improve it. That's what's called proximal separation. And proximal separation, given the stresses on parents these days, is a major problem in parenting. And because the recent study showed, when parents are stressed, they can't be attuned, connected with their kids emotionally. And the child experience that is absent. It's very confusing for the kids, by the way. Because when you try and ask them, well, my parents were always there. But nobody remembers their parents' emotional absence, because you can't remember what didn't happen. Two things, as the British psychiatrist D.W. Winnicott said, there's two things that can go wrong in childhood. Two things that can go amiss. One, if things happen that shouldn't happen, and that's the abuse and the neglect and the sexual exploitation or whatever. That's what happened that shouldn't have happened. But the other thing that can go wrong is when things don't happen that should happen. It's easy to study the factors that shouldn't have happened but did. So you can ask people, was there addiction in your family? Were your parents jailed? Did your father beat your mother? Were you abused? Those are the things that shouldn't have happened. It's harder to study, but just as important, when things didn't happen that should have. And I've talked to so many people that tell me, oh yeah, I know my parents were loving, wonderful people. And they were. But then you ask the question, when you're upset as a child, who did you talk to? Nobody. Well, that's what should have happened. Is there should have been somebody there to really see the child and to recognize the child's distress. That's often lacking. Not because the parents don't love the child or don't do their best, because they're too distracted, too stressed, or they're dealing with their own unresolved issues, or not dealing with them. I talked about attunement. Now, attunement is an important. Okay, so let me go back to brain development before I get there. So brain development. So much of that happens in the first few years of life. So 80 or 90% of the development of the brain happens after birth. By the third year of life, the end of that, the human brain is 80% adult size, 90% adult size. The human body is only 17 or 18% adult size. There's a rapid period of development, or a period of rapid development. So there are times in the first year of life when literally every second, so consider this space of time. In that space of time, 1 billion connections are being made in the brain. So it's a highly sensitive period. And the environment decides or influences which circuits will survive and which circuits get pruned out. The babies get many more circuits than they need, many more connections than they need. It's a little jungle. If you looked at an EEG of an infant, and you didn't know it was an infant, you thought it was an adult, you would be looking at a dying person. And the brain gets totally disorganized. That's what the baby's brain is like. Except, due to the influence of the environment, all that disorganization turns into organization, and the circuits that are not needed get pruned out. That's called synaptic pruning. And the ones that need to be there get wired in and strengthened and connected and reconnected and developed into systems and circuits and so on. But all that depends and depends upon the right environment thing. Now think about tuning up. So let me answer this question. If I were to stress one of you right now, be inappropriate, physically or emotionally intrusive or aggressive, what would be your options? Well, the options would be any one of three healthy options. You could simply stand up and say, don't do that. You can just stand up and fight back and assert yourself, right? Could you not? The other thing you can do is just walk out to the door and say, listen, I didn't come here to be abused. I quit this workshop. Just walk out. Your third option would be, if you couldn't do the first two, is that given that there's 50 or so people here in the room with you, you could ask for help. But what now if you couldn't escape, fight back, or ask for help? Then how would your brain handle it? Well, one of the ways your brain would handle it would be to tune it out, so that to protect yourself from the pain of it. So the tuning out, again, is a survival technique. But what happens if you're an infant and your parents are stressed, which means that you're stressed, because you're picking up on your parents' stresses. So that your parents are stressed and you're stressed, can you fight back, escape, or ask for help? You can't. What do? You tune out. You tune out when your brain is developing. You tune out when every second a billion connections are being made. And then the tune out is wired into your brain. It becomes the default setting of your brain. 7 years later, you're diagnosed with ADHD. Genetic disease. The heck it is. Furthermore, your dopamine circuits, those motivational circuits, didn't develop either. So now you need a dopamine medication like Ritalin or Dexedrine to help you focus and to get things done. Simply because the early environment was so stressed. Now, when it comes to FASD and ADHD, first of all, you can notice that all the behavioral traits of ADHD are also true of the behavioral traits of FASD. Poor impulse control, lack of emotional self-regulation, hyperactivity, low ability to concentrate. Now, alcohol, of course, and this is an expansion of what I said last night. Alcohol, of course, is a toxin. It affects the brain, as you've been hearing all day, I'm sure. And when it's present in large quantities, it'll have drastic effects on the physiology of the child. Heart abnormalities, facial abnormalities, brain abnormalities that you can see on brain scans, and so on. But in a lot of kids affected by the spectrum, you don't see these traits at all. You just see the behaviors and the emotional dysfunction. I think it's a mistake to assume that it's all because of the alcohol. Because, everything I've said about the parents of the child with ADHD is also true of the parents of the child with FASD. And any woman who drinks is by definition a stressed woman. That's why she drinks. The alcohol is it's her attempt to soothe her emotional pain that usually goes back to her own trauma as a child, which she's been carrying all her life. Because she was traumatized, and that's not my opinion, the large-scale studies again show that the more adversity there is in childhood, in other words, physical, sexual, emotional abuse, and all these other factors like parental absence or violence in the family and so on, the greater the risk of alcoholism, the greater the risk of obesity, the greater the risk of addiction, and so on and so forth. So the alcoholic is simply somebody who was traumatized as a child and is using the alcohol to soothe their emotional pain and to get their mind into a more acceptable state. Likely, of course, if they had those experiences in childhood, they have not created for themselves a stress-free environment as adults either. More than likely, they'll be in a relationship with a male alcoholic, perhaps, or in an abusive relationship, and in many ways leading a life that's full of stress. Now, is it just the alcohol that's affecting that infant in the uterus? Heck no. It's also all the stress on the woman, for the same reasons I've already explained. And that child is not born into a happy environment. Because if the parents are drinkers, that child is born into a highly stressed and unstable environment. So all those years of brain development are occurring under conditions of high stress, having that impact on a child's brain circuits. So what I'm saying is that the relationship between FASD and ADHD is very simple. They both come from the same source. Stress in the parenting environment. With the addition that in the fetal alcohol syndrome situation, you also have the added effect of alcohol to lesser or greater degrees. But the significant difference is between perspectives is that if we recognize that a lot of it has to do with stress and its biological effects, then we also know that the brain can undergo new development even later on in life. And that is what is called neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity, the capacity of the brain to develop new circuits later on in life. given the right conditions. So I mentioned last night the studies done in Berkeley with rats, where they took rats with at different ages, young, adult, newborns, and they even took some old ones. They even took some rats at birth and deliberately brain damaged them. And then they exposed these animals to different levels of environmental stimulation. And 2 months later, at any age, at any stage, and even the deliberately brain damaged rats, if they're exposed to more nourishing environmental stimulation, social stimulation, they were better able to find their way out of a maze, they were smarter. And when you autopsied them, in the front part of the brain, they had larger nerve cells with more connections and richer blood supply. In other words, the environmental stimulation led to positive changes in the very physiology and structure of the brain. This is true of the old rats, this is true of the deliberately brain damaged rats. Which is to say that the key to working with these kids is the environment. And what is the key environmental factor? It's what was missing in the first place. Unconditional, non-stressed, attuned interaction with caregiving adults. Well, let me tell you about attunement. Because attunement is what was missing for these kids. And it was missing because the parents were too distracted or stressed. Attunement is being on the same wavelength. Being in tune with. Being in tune. Emotional. So attunement is when you're in a certain emotional state and somebody who's attuned to you will get it and share it and reflect that back to you. So this is something that with babies we do instinctively. It's no big deal. It's not a big technique. It's simply something we do instinctively as human beings as long as we're present. So with a baby who's upset, a 3-month-old who's crying, we will attune. We will not do what we'll do with each other or with an older child. We will not say something stupid like, get over it, it can't be that bad. We will not say, hey, 3-month-old, think of the starving millions in the third world. What are you whining about? Your diaper's wet. So what? We're not going to do that. We're going to pick them up and we're going to go, oh. And what our facial expression and tone of voice and body language is conveying is, hey kid, you're sad. I get that you're sad, and I'm sad that you're sad. And then the kid can, hey. That's how the functions of the adult brain regulates the brain of the child through attunement. So these kids need a lot of attunement. Now, imagine what it's like for you. You're sitting there upset, and somebody slaps your shoulder and says, cheer up, it can't be that bad. I mean, even as adults, we get infuriated. But kids need attunement much more because they're much more dependent on their relationship, and particularly these kids do, because they've never had it. So there was a study done with mothers and children, small children, put into separate rooms, but broadcast to one another by means of closed-circuit television. So the mother would see the child on the screen, and the child would see the mother on the screen. And the child would wave, and the mother would wave back, and the child would wrinkle up her nose, make a funny face, and the mother would copy her. And everybody's very happy until they turn off the live feed, and they replay for the child a video of the mother that was just made. She's still smiling, loving gestures, friendly, intimate expressions, be playful and funny, but the child gets upset very quickly. And why do you suppose? Because the mother is no longer responsive. It doesn't matter that the mother is loving and friendly. What matters is that the child is not responding to the parent, the mother is not responding to the child. So these kids need a lot of attunement emotionally. To go back to that situation in Toronto, the human brain or the human nervous system has three responses to challenge. One of them is the primitive reptilian response, which is embedded in the lower part of the brain, which is to freeze. That's called immobilization. It involves physical stillness so that you won't be noticed, and dissociation. So that a mouse, when caught by a cat, will actually dissociate. Sure, I didn't open the door so people could leave my lecture. So, a mouse, when caught by a cat, will actually dissociate, and then it's not so bad to be eaten. That's called immobilization. That's the primitive reptilian response, but it's in our brains. The second level of response is mobilization, where you a lot of adrenaline, and the heart rate goes up, and you're going to fight or escape. That's the sympathetic nervous system, mammalian flight or fight response. Those are defensive states. There's no learning that happens in those states. Now these kids, because they were traumatized early or they were just stressed early, from uterus onwards, are in constant defensive mode. They're constantly in defensive mode. They're either in immobilization mode or they're in hypermobilization mode when they can't learn. So they don't learn from anything that happens. They keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. They can't help it because there's no learning in those defensive states. Learning only happens in a state called social engagement. Social engagement involves different nerves, different facial muscles, different neck muscles. That's when you look at somebody, you look them in the eye, and you listen to their voice, and you interact. In that social engagement mode, learning can take place. But these kids have to be got to that state. So for that, they need a lot of safety. Here in the temporal lobe, on each side of the brain, we have sensors. Just like the thermostat. Basically, these sensors read the safety of the situation. We're constantly assessing safety. We're all doing this all the time. We're assessing safety. When we're not safe, we respond in different ways. The problem, of course, is that when the early environment was difficult, stressful, or traumatic, our proper ability to assess safety may not develop well. So sometimes we'll put ourselves into situations that are not safe and think that they are. And that's why women traumatized often go into very unsafe relationships. And sometimes we don't see safety when it's there. So we're not able to relax even when we're safe. So a lot of extra input has to happen to make these kids feel safe. And that's why their attunement is so important. Without that attunement, their brain never relaxes. It's always in defensive mode. When it's in defensive mode, it can't learn. So no adaptation happens, no development happens. And that's why the essential condition for development is unconditional loving acceptance, attunement, support, and the presence of the adults. Not all the techniques that we use. There's nothing wrong with the techniques. But as the spiritual teacher Krishnamurti wrote, and whose quote I used in the beginning of two of my books, he says, action is meaning only in relationship, and without understanding relationship, action on any level will only breed conflict. The understanding of relationship is infinitely more important than the search for any plan of action. The understanding of relationship is infinitely more important than the search for any plan of action. So let me give you an example. These kids are often very oppositional. They resist, right? We even diagnose them with oppositional defiant disorder. Now here's the thing about oppositionality. Would you mind putting your hand up for me, please? So what are you doing when I push on you?
I push back.
And the harder I push?
Push back because I don't want you in my life.
Yeah, right. Gee, you don't? Okay. So the harder I push, the harder you push back. Okay? That's a natural human resistance to coercion. There's a natural human resistance to coercion, physical or emotional. My friend Gordon Neufeld calls that counter-will. Okay? Nothing wrong with it. Now, when we say that a kid is oppositional, We're saying something about that. But in this interaction between Denise and I, she wasn't alone in it. I was there too. I was pushing on her. That's why she pushed back. Why would I diagnose her with being oppositional instead of looking at the relationship? In other words, oppositionality is not a trait of the child. It's a function of the relationship. Now what mitigates oppositionality is relationship, right? If you and I were in a different relationship, you might want me in your lap. You know, there's some people that you do want in your lap, you know, and many others that you don't. So what mitigates oppositionality is relationship. If I mistake your oppositionality for some innate trait of yours, and I try to change it behaviorally by pushing harder on you, you're just going to push harder back. If I want you not to be oppositional, I have to build a relationship with you. That's the key with these kids. When we just try and focus on the behaviors, we do harm. That's what Krishnamurti says. Without understanding relationship, any plan of action will only breed conflict. Now think of the time out situation, the separation. When we say to a 3-year-old, okay, time out, what are we saying? We're saying to the child, you know kid, I know what your biggest need is. Your biggest need is the attachment relationship in which you can feel safe and nurtured with me. And hence, I also happen to know what your biggest fear is, which is the loss of that relationship. And you know what? I'm going to use that against you every time I don't like what you do. Are we increasing the child's sense of safety, or are we decreasing it? We're getting the behavior that we want, because the kids, oh yeah, okay, I'll be good. And the 3-year-old can't stand the separation from the parent, unless they're already detached. So, the issue in ADHD, FASD, any of these related childhood conditions is not short-term behavioral goals, but long-term developmental goals. If we understand that we're not talking about a disease here, but we're talking about a problem of development, then the question we'll be asking at every turn is not what will promote good behavior in the second, but what will promote healthy development in the long term. And the things that we do to get the healthy or the desired behavior in the short term very often completely undermine the long-term behavior, developmental goal. And unfortunately, medical schools don't teach this. The faculties of education, I'm sure, don't teach it. They sure didn't when I went to educational school, when I was a teacher for a year. And I don't think they do now. And they don't teach it in schools of psychology either, which means we're constantly misreading kids. We're not seeing what matters. We're not looking at their emotional experience. I'm going to stop here for a moment. Just got to stop talking steadily. At what time is the session finished? 4:30. 4:30. Okay. Let me stop here for questions now then. Any comments or questions on that stuff? Yeah.
Well, you made this point numerous times yesterday and today about the fact that the medical community, education community, and in some cases our parenting and I guess our political system is such that these things aren't being taught. Now we talked about research being in place that has established that these cases, this stuff exists.
Yeah.
Why the disconnect?
Why the disconnect?
And
Well,
then
you know
further,
what,
how do we make that connection?
Yeah, well, the good news is that this information is getting out more and more now. At least now we have this article in this month's journal, Pediatrics Journal. Now, let me tell you, it's going to get ignored by a lot of people. I was speaking in Calgary at the Calgary Children's Hospital, I think probably 2 weeks ago today, and this article had just come out, and I was talking to the doctors there, and I was saying all this stuff, and I said, look, here it is. Right here, and I was very pleased because, it was right there, in their journal. This response I got, and I said pretty much what I told you today. So blank. It was blank. Didn't know what to do with it. Part of the problem is that I could put the problem into the lap of the medical profession, is that we're just not training people the way we should. Of course, the influence of the pharmaceutical companies has a lot to do with it, because the research is mostly funded by pharmaceuticals. This research was not, but most research is. There's no profits to be made in nurturing relationships. Lots of profits to be made in selling drugs. So what gets printed in the medical journals is stuff that's funded by people who've got a profit motive. That's an obvious fact. The fact that a lot of people that go into medical school are people who are very stressed and workaholics and all that, they haven't dealt with their own stuff, that also contributes to it. But you know, it's beyond that. We live in a culture that separates the mind from the body. And since you asked a political question, I'll give you a political answer. The essence of this society is the profit motive. For the sake of the profit motive, we have to treat people like commodities. So people are fundamentally wealth-producing or wealth-consuming creatures, but they don't have any other function. And in a situation, and the schools actually, the way we have them now, you know where they developed? They were developed in Prussia in the 19th century, where they were industrializing, and they needed a docile and obedient, but intelligent and educated working force. So they developed these schools, where kids sit the whole day and their hands behind their back, and they respect the teacher's authority and all that. Well, that wasn't designed with the needs of the child in mind. Who in their right mind would design a school system where kids have to sit at a desk the whole day? If you're talking about children's needs. In other words, the system's needs are what's being served very often. And even now in the school system, very often, it's not the fault of individual teachers. I know what dedicated teachers are. And I know what stuff they go through to teach the material to the kids. But the problem is that the schools are even now not designed for the kids that we have. They're designed for some ideal students who learn at the same rate, at the same time, at the same age, in the same way. No child was ever like that. And instead of saying, what the school system ought to be saying, is that if due to the stresses and pressures and distractions of modern society, we're producing a lot of these kids with these problems, we better fit the schools around the needs of these kids. And if we did, we'd have a very different situation in the classroom and in the school setting. But no, we try and fit the kid in, and when the kid doesn't fit in, then we label them, and we medicate them, and we deal with their behavior. So, you know, I could go on much longer about your question, but there's a huge systemic bias against this kind of understanding.
Well, and one of the reasons I ask it is because we're about to go through an educational change in our province that's on the books right now. Which is individualized education.
Which means?
Well, nobody's been able to articulate that to the best of my, and I've gone to many presentations. But one of the things that hasn't come up with that I've heard or observed is how do we deal with the issues that are arising and the labeling of kids.
Yeah.
They're talking about individualization so that kids can reach their potential and blah, blah, blah. But again, it's based on that model of the ideal student that's being able to make rational decisions about what they want or need in their education.
That's right.
And I haven't seen anybody be able to articulate how it's going to help the kids that I work with.
Exactly. In fact, it's not. And it's designed again, as you say, for that ideal student. And you know, in the States now, but also in Canada, pretty soon, there's going to be more and more pressure for computerized teaching, where kids actually stay at home and they learn the computer. Now that's fine for the self-motivated child.
They can afford the device.
Sorry?
They can afford the device.
Who can afford the device, yeah. But what about the children who are not self-regulated? You know, that's going to be, because people need that, they need your voice.
Yeah.
They need your facial expression, they need your presence, they need your friendly pat on their back, you need that smile on your face to feel that safety where they can open up and learn. They're not going to get that from a computer. I mean, we're going in we're running headlong in the wrong direction. You know, I should be given, I mean, look, it's not that I need more speaking engagements. I have trouble keeping up. But I stress myself out working too much. But because I don't pay attention to my own teachings, I say no sometimes. But really, I should be speaking to the schools a lot more. And I am. And when I do, the response is always great. I mean, teachers have appreciated getting this stuff, you know. So I spoke with thousands of teachers. It's interesting, like in Alberta, I spoke to thousands of teachers. BC, maybe hundreds. I'm going to school in Surrey this Friday, but on the whole, Gordon and I should be in the schools much more. Because the schools are such important constituencies. Where this information would actually make a difference. Anyway, other questions? Really?
What about the idea that you, like, I mean, I understand working with people in schools and stuff, I think that everybody should really have this information.
Yeah.
But I think that, I know that lots of people who work in the school system and stuff like that too, a lot of it has to do with policy,
Yeah.
what's happening. You know, I know people who teach and have ideas and stuff like that, and then
Yeah.
find themselves in positions where they can't actually do what they want to do because they're being dictated from a whole different level that manipulates how they educate.
Yeah.
So, I mean...
And all the standardized tests and all that nonsense.
Yeah.
IEPs.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Look, I think that the best thing I can say, it's a huge problem which you can't resolve actually. But I advise people to be subversives.
Yeah.
Like, you know,
As if we're not.
in other words, you have to find ways as best you can to subvert the system. When I say subvert, I don't mean in a negative way. I mean to do what kids need, regardless of the system, as best you can. You know, and it's the same as my dilemma as a medical doctor, or any physician who goes beyond the narrow confines of what was taught in medical school. You have to kind of go, you know, stay clean and respectable and knowledgeable, but do what you know as best you can. And that can make a difference to the lives of a lot of kids. Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of like a lot of what you're speaking of and a lot of what everybody else has been speaking of is kind of around the idea of increasing social capital for families.
Yes.
And yet a lot of us are in different programs and you know, like ministries will mandate parents to come to programs while their children are in school, elders are at home or wherever. And the generations are all just separated all day throughout the whole week. And nobody's working out of their needs and interests. They're, like you said, you're working based on societal demands.
Yeah.
And so schools are designed around that to produce. And so we would be so much more in a favorable position if parents of these children could work from their needs and interests rather than 9 to 5, always producing Monday to Friday. And one of the things that I was thinking of was like, wow, you know, like I'd be so much better off if my office was in the outdoors only, and if anybody wanted to access me, that's where I'm at, and my kids are with me.
You might be a bit cold today.
Yeah, oh, I'd love that.
Would you? Yeah.
Yeah, and like when I think about it, like my daughter's in school, my son's in daycare,
Yeah.
I'm here, my wife's somewhere else, you
Yeah.
know. It's very, very rare if we can all come together
Yeah.
and be in the moment and be present.
And not only that, even then you'll be advised to have play dates and sleepovers and take your kids to this activity and that activity, and yeah, but it's just how it is. It's, you know, it's really the challenge. And so the challenge, if I can put it very bluntly, is to maintain sanity in the face of an insane system. And even the phrase social capital is very revealing. Why do we call it capital as it goes money?
I know. That's just using it term as real.
And I'm not criticizing you.
Yeah.
I'm saying that even our phraseology reflects the economic organization under which we live.
It's like all those expectations that you can pile on each different generation diminishes how much time they spend with each other. And if they didn't have to do all those different things, the children's development and even the family's development could be more community-based, more cultural.
Absolutely.
And we'd probably see a lot less of the struggle.
Absolutely. So thank you. So I'd like to leave you on a positive note, which is that at the same time as socially, you might say things are getting more difficult, more and more people are waking up to how it is. And more and more people are recognizing this information about child development and early brain development. It's much more prevalently available now than it was even 5 years ago. And again, it doesn't matter how troubled these kids are, their potential is enormous if we give them the right environment. And the biggest impact that you can have as individuals with an individual child is simply the relationship that you can provide, and you can do that in the space of 5 minutes. So that difficult as it is, and as challenging as it is, their potential for development and our capacity to support that development is really much greater than we sometimes imagine. And so, as the psychologist Marian Diamond, who did these rat experiments with these rats of different ages, she said that based on her findings, you never give up on any human being. You just don't. Mm-hmm. And I'll finish with a quote from a psychiatrist, Dr. Stanley Greenspan, who he's retired now, but he was for a number of years the head of the infant development program at the U.S. National Institutes of Health, and he was interested in autism. So, as a child psychiatrist, Stanley Greenspan has had a very special interest in the treatment of autism, a form of neurophysiological and psychological dysfunction far more disabling than attention deficit disorder. Dr. Greenspan reports that some children with autism have been helped to become intelligent and emotionally healthy with, quote, cognitive, emotional, and social skills in a normal or even superior range. And how they did that is through relationship. So he says, if large numbers of children who showed such severe physiological symptoms that were diagnosed as autistic or retarded could be brought into interaction patterns that allowed them enormous growth, what of lesser challenges? So if you deal with the autistic kids, not that that's fully understood yet, but if it can be done with autistic kids, it can certainly be done with these other kids as well. And let me finally put in a plug for animals here. Because animals get past all the mind stuff, they go directly to the emotional centers of the brain. So that if a child can develop a relationship with an animal, and so there's actually particularly trained animals. I don't know if you know this, but there are people that do call it equine therapy, it's called. They work with horses. These kids are great candidates for that. Because human beings, we're just about incapable of being so present and emotionally accepting as animals are. So for these kids, use whatever modalities are available. Play, outdoors, the land a lot. They really need to be connected to the land. Animals, and again, above all, your presence. Well, thanks for the attention.
And my friend Carmen would never complain to me about piano practice. Aaron Feist would never call Kira Miss Sunshine. Alex Schachter would never walk into school with his brother Ryan. Scott Beagle would never joke around with Cameron at camp. Helen Ramsey would never hang out after school with Max. Gina Montalto would never wave to her friend Liam at lunch. Joaquin Oliver would never play basketball with Sam or Dylan. Elena Petty would never, Kara Lugren would never, Chris Hickson would never, Luke Hoyer would never, Marquine Duque Aguiano would never, Peter Wang would never, Alyssa Al-Hadaf would never, Jamie Guttenberg would never, Meadow Pollock would never.